Spencer, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, name's Spencer, like you said. For a living, I suppose, I'm active duty Air Force, have been now for about 17 years. Married, 4 children, and then in our spare time, me and my wife, who is not here today, we sort of co-host our podcast, the Religionless Christianity podcast, and just try to, do that 6 days a week. And outside of that, it's just kids and family life, and keeps us busy.
Cool. Religionless, as in like not the social aspect or the human aspect kind of thing. Is that what it means by religionless?
Well, so the name comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you're familiar, uh, I really enjoyed Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and when reading through and understanding what I thought, he meant with the religionless Christianity take, sort of how do you live a Christian life in a religionless world, which he obviously thought 1930s Germany was becoming a pretty religionless world. So that's kind of why we took the name. We've gotten some stern comments about how it's trickery that we're called religionless when we're in fact pretty religious. It's not our intent. We try to be pretty upfront on every episode, and even in our descriptions, that where the name comes from. Bonhoeffer was a pretty religious guy, so that's where the name comes from.
Gotcha. So could you tell me some of the reasons you believe in Christianity? I'm an atheist, by which, of course, I mean that I think everything is better explained by naturalism. I think naturalism can answer all the arguments and indicates all the evidence better. So tell me some of the reasons you believe there are for belief in Christianity.
Yeah, it's funny. Like looking back through some of your channels or some of your videos and all the people that you've discussed different topics with. And I was like, boy, am I not to the same level there with some of the guys you've had discussions with, but I do appreciate it. But
well, you're also far above the level of many of the people I've discussed with. So like I've had like Flat Earthers, Darth Dawkins, Godless Girl. Like you probably don't recognize any of those names, but yeah, if you check those out, you'll realize there's a low bar for the T-Jump channel. So don't worry about it.
Oh, you get a lot of videos. I mean, you got to keep the content coming. And yeah, so why I believe, I know you said that you think naturalism. I think us being here, is a strong indication for me that makes sense. I think it was John Locke who kind of said we're reasoning and thinking beings. So that would indicate that we had to be created by a reasoning and thinking being. The idea being that something less intelligent than us couldn't create us. So that, is a reason why I believe. I believe the Bible. When I read it, it makes sense to me.
Well, let's go back to the first one just for a minute. Why would we need a thinking, intelligent being to create us? For example, there are lots of emergent properties that exist without prior properties. So, for example, water comes from non-water, walls come from non-walls, houses come from non-houses, life comes from non-life, consciousness from non-consciousness. So why would having an intelligent being somehow be different than everything else in the universe, which seems to come from things that are don't have any of the properties they have? So like stars, obviously I don't think you don't believe God's a star. I don't believe the fundamental nature of a universe is a star. So stars come from non-stars. Why wouldn't thinking beings be any different?
Well, I mean, but I guess the properties that make up each star exist. They aren't, just popping into existence as a star. I mean, they're there to be put together, I guess, into that mode. Hydrogen and oxygen, right, are there to be put together to make water. So I think that would be, but ultimately, I think it ultimately just goes back to, the idea that, and I'm sure you've heard the argument plenty of times before. I can't imagine that, something can't create or nothing can't create something. And that just makes sense.
Well, I agree with that part for sure. I agree that nothing can't create something. But in the case of intelligence, I think intelligence is also just built of more fundamental things like particles and fields, just like stars are. So why would brains be any different than a star? It's just a large composite of other things. And those other things seem to be able to combine just fine without an intelligence. So why would intelligence be fundamentally different from stars?
I don't know why they would be, but I think they are, right? I mean, I think you would recognize that intelligence is different than just a solid material like a rock sitting on the ground. Intelligence seems to be something different than that. Again, I don't know why, right? But it does. I think it is. I think it's easy to recognize that consciousness, intelligence is something different, set apart from an inanimate object like a rock.
What do you mean? So, like, there's obviously lots of things in the universe: stars, black holes, particles, tornadoes, hurricanes, um, oceans. They're all different from one another. But why would intelligence be so different that it requires an entirely new ontology and not just a composite of the natural stuff? So, for example, there's lots of stuff that we see that comes about by natural processes, crystals. I think all life does, all organisms do. Why would brains somehow be fundamentally different than anything else? Consciousness, intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a brain as far as why would it be different? I guess not. I mean, as far as what it's made of, but just what it produces. Um, why is it different? Why would it be different? I don't know why it would be, but I think it is. I think we both I mean, I would assume. I guess I thought, right? I'm not trying to assume anything because not smart enough to assume what anybody else would think. But um, to me, intelligence, consciousness seems to be of a different substance than what makes up a tornado.
I'm not sure I follow because from my perspective, it seems like consciousness is best explained as an emergent property from brains. Just your brain is just a computer of some kind. It processes information, and information can be processed by many different things on the cellular level. On the molecular level, you can have different combinations of particles that interact with other combinations of particles, and if they react to some but not others, then you have a computer. You now have a computer. It computes whether or not it's hit by particle X instead of particle Y. And cells and living organisms are just complicated chemical structures that are just doing that all the time. So, like chemicals, like crystals, are doing that. They're computing whether or not they're hit by sodium or chlorine to grow or to decay or whatever. And so it seems like all of the things that are required in the brain are just complicated processes of uh, input and output systems, just like a computer is. And that can be done with non-conscious things just fine. And if you have enough of a complicated system, it would produce consciousness. So I don't see why we would need an entirely new system of stuff out there to account for intelligence. It's just a specifically complicated process of the the matter stuff that we see, as far as I can tell. That's what all the evidence seems to indicate.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know that I'd be smart enough to give you any sort of scientific understanding of why intelligence would be different than, um, like you said, a crystal forming. Um, again, to me, and just a simple man, it seems different to me. It seems like something more than just solid, materials formed together or just particles moving around. Seems to be something at a higher level than that.
Do you think that's like a trustworthy way to know things about the universe? Because like there's a lot of historical examples where things seemed really implausible to people, like Newton. Isaac Newton said that it was impossible to calculate the orbits of the planets and their effect on gravity altogether, and only a god could do that. And then Laplace came along like a few hundred years later. It's like, no, I can do it. Gotcha, I got this. So there's lots of things that seem really implausible, hard to understand for humans, but later on, technologically, it seems like it's not that big of a deal anymore. So, like, I think that in a few hundred years, we're going to discover how more about consciousness and how it arises and how life comes from non-life. And so these questions are going to be solved, just like how there's a diversity of species. Like people used to say the exact same thing about the diversity of species and how it could only be done by God until Darwin came along. He's like, no, I got this. I got this. I solved this one. And the same thing happened to lightning. People used to think it was Zeus, must be Zeus, can't be done by natural processes because we don't see any natural process that can help us um, be able to imagine what's going on there. So it must be a mind because that's like our default explanation of everything we don't understand. But don't you think it's more plausible that our sensation that it's really hard to understand something is more of a product of our inbuilt evolutionary biases rather than telling us something true about the fundamental nature of reality?
I mean, I think that there are people wrestling with that from a, you know, theological point of view. I mean, there's obviously much smarter men than me in the sciences that are wrestling with those very topics. And um, I would probably not be smart enough to sum up what they are theorizing, but I'm sure you're aware of, you know, some of them. The only names that really pop up are like the William Lane Craigs of the world, who you may disagree with, you know, but uh, somebody that is far more intelligent that's in those fields. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I can't really speak to anything super intelligent and super deep when it comes to the scientific fields. But I know that there are people working and wrestling with those from a theological point of view. And I'm certain, at least the ones that I've heard, they feel very comfortable and confident in their assertions that there still must be a God ultimately to bring about life and human life. So again, I feel okay just being like, yeah, I don't really understand that. I don't know. I'm not that smart in those fields to really make any sort of solid stance in that realm.
Well, do you think that there's a reason that the science tends to lean one way rather than another, and why um, just because several experts tend to think something's possible, is that a really good reason to believe it? Because there's lots of experts out there, and you can always find a few experts who take very fringe positions that aren't well accepted. But I don't think that makes it reasonable to accept those positions, especially as, like, I'm not an expert in many of these fields either. And so what I think the reasonable thing to do is to go with consensus. What do the majority of experts think is the best explanation of this phenomenon or something? Um, and then instead of like saying, here is an expert who agrees with my intuitions, therefore I'm going to agree with that expert instead of the majority of them.
Well, I mean, I guess that, you know, ultimately comes down to maybe why you're going into the fields, what each person's sort of indication. I mean, I always thought, I don't know, science, the goal of science, at least in my opinion, was never to really necessarily disprove God, but more understand how God did things, you know, how God made the world. Um, so I don't know if maybe just, you know, they sort of breed on each other, right? I mean, if a more atheistic mindset gets into science and that begins to sort of lay some groundwork, the people that follow after them tend to be more in that same mold. I don't know if that's at least a small part of it, or, you know, maybe it's like I don't know, COVID in the medical world, right? Like just certain narratives they want out there. Those are the narratives that get out. So that just seems to be like, hey, all the consensus is vaccines are the way we end COVID. And that doesn't really seem to be the case, even though all medical science and the experts, right, might tell you that's the way that it works, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I don't think they ever said it was going to end COVID. COVID's a virus. You can't, unless you can eliminate literally all of it everywhere on the planet, it's not going to end. And so I
Right.
don't
Not
think
end
anybody
COVID, but as far as like, you know,
mitigate
the
the consequences.
lockdowns, yeah, the pandemic,
Well, so
that
like
sort
in
of
the
stuff.
case of consciousness, the consensus, the vast majority of experts in neurology, psychology, cognitive science, philosophy of mind, they're all physicalists. They all think that it's just the mind. There's nothing more than the mind. And there are apologists who think that no, it's got to be more than the mind, and they use this as a way to try to argue for more stuff, more than just the physical stuff. But the vast majority of experts don't, and I don't think it's fair to say it's a bias, because over the past 300, 400 years, the vast majority of experts have all been religious, and specifically on big instances where things like Darwin came along and discredited fundamentally religious ideas that, like, speciesization was caused by a god, are factors of why they aren't any more religious, because any explanation that was used that people thought God did it was like a gap. It was just a gap of, here, we don't know, therefore God. And then once we discovered it, like, it's just a natural process. And it ends up always being a natural process. And so in the context of something like the mind, the field that tells us the most is neurology, where it's making novel predictions about, well, if the mind is physical and we sever the corpus callosum, then we'll have two consciousnesses develop in the same brain. It'll be very strange. And that's what we see happen. And so it seems like the field that, or the interpretation of the data that is the most reasonable is physicalism, not because of biases, but because that's what the evidence seems to indicate. And the alternative hypothesis of a God doesn't seem like it's made any progress in science at all. And so it's not a bias of rejecting that because they just don't like the hypothesis, but because it hasn't ever provided any real evidence in the field, as opposed to physicalism.
So I guess, as someone who understands more about the sciences, is there a way for them to, I guess, do the science in a way that would indicate that there's a God who set it all in motion?
Sure. Novel testable predictions. You just say, like, one way to do it would be pray for God to heal your limbs, and if it worked every time, that would be great evidence. Or pray for a gold brick, and if he gave you a gold brick, that'd be evidence. Or like if Genesis 1:1 was inscribed in the DNA somewhere, that would be good evidence. There's lots of different ways that could indicate that. It would just be the same thing as any science. You just say, if I have a hypothesis, if this hypothesis is true, here's what I would expect to see under some experiment. Do the experiment and see the result, and that would be evidence. Like if the stuff in Revelation happens, that would be great evidence. Like if all the Christians, or a large portion of Christians, just magically disappeared one day, that'd be great evidence of Christianity. And if we die and see God after we die, that would also be great evidence. So there are definitely ways to verify the existence of supernatural beings. Problem is, it just hasn't worked.
Yeah, I mean, I guess not really sure. That you could do a natural experiment to, because I mean, the Bible doesn't even indicate that you would pray for something, and every time you would be healed, or you would pray for something. So, um, at least in the Christian faith, right, that's not something that you could experiment on and expect to be a result. Now, obviously, Revelation, yeah, if if we see Jesus coming from the clouds, that's a good indication. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm not well enough versed in the scientific fields to have any sort of, deep understanding as to why this is starting to trend this way. Other than the people that seem to be drawn to the science fields have a more naturalistic, atheistic mindset. And again, that could be something that is bred into them from the sciences, what they've learned, or that's just who tends to go into that field.
Well, I think it's like what you said earlier, that Christianity doesn't provide any testable predictions. It doesn't give anything that's like, or at least ones that we can test, where we can say, if this is true, here's some tests we can do to confirm it, do the test and confirm it. Like, there aren't any of those, which means Christianity doesn't offer a hypothesis with predictions. And so it doesn't even count as science. It's not even a thing that most scientists would accept as a plausible explanation of anything, because it doesn't offer a prediction. Whereas physical stuff does. It makes, like, if this is physical and we mess with it, it'll cause changes to your consciousness. And so it seems like the vast majority of scientists don't accept the religious interpretations, because the religious interpretations offer nothing of value in the scientific hypothesis realm. They don't offer predictions. And so going with the religious hypothesis doesn't seem to be a valid scientific method, which is why the vast majority of people don't go with it in any of the sciences. I don't think it's a bias. I think it's just, it doesn't offer testable predictions, and so you can't confirm it, and so it doesn't offer anything to say other than a preconceived bias of some kind, of something you want to believe is true. And so it's hard to accept that as a scientific explanation at all.
Do you, and this is just me asking the question to try to learn, do you think that science is the only way that you can come to know that there's a God? There's no other way, I guess, in your mind, that you can come to know that there's a God? I mean, you're saying if science can't test and hasn't proved, or at least hasn't proved that there's a God, and therefore there can't be a God, is there another way outside of a scientific environment, to know that there's a God, or that it
Sure,
would?
there could be, yeah, there could be lots of ways. Like, anything that can differentiate imagination from reality counts as evidence. And the way we do that right now is through novel testable predictions. You predict the future. If my hypothesis is true, here's a prediction of the future, test it, find out. And that is a good way to be able to show that it's not just something in your imagination, because our imagination is very bad at predicting the future. So if you have a model that can predict the future, it's good reason to trust the model. So science, whatever method you come up with that will do that, science is going to adopt it. But there could be lots of other methods outside of the current scientific method that could do that. You just need to find one. I don't know of any that can do that other than like the confirmed ones accepted by science, and which is also including philosophy. But those don't indicate God, as far as I'm aware.
Well, would you not? I mean, I guess you wouldn't count then like Old Testament prophecies in regards to Jesus being fulfilled as that sort of predicting the future in a sense.
Well,
That
sure, I
way,
would. I would definitely count if they were actual predictions. They would definitely count as evidence. But for all of the ones I've looked at are super vague, can be interpreted in many ways. Like the best prediction of I've ever heard of was from Hinduism, and it predicts the age of the Earth is 4.3 billion years old. It's about five. It's off by like 5%, so it's like 95% accurate. Very very close prediction, and that's one really good prediction. That's better than any of the ones in Christianity or uh, the other religions I've studied, because it's very specific, very precise, gives a number. And most of the ones in, or pretty much all of the ones in Christianity are very vague. You can interpret them in many ways. Like there's the one about how the one that's claimed to be of Jesus, where they say they're going to pierce his hands and feet, but crucifixion, they don't pierce the hands, they pierce the wrist. So it's, you have to like vaguely interpret these statements to try and make them fit the narrative. And it never says this will happen to Jesus. It'll say it'll happen to something, and some word might be able to be interpreted as the Messiah, or it could refer to somebody at that exact time period, like a week later, um, in the story. So I think a few of the prophecies are said to happen about somebody, and they read that as happening to the Messiah, when really it was just that guy's son or something. They were literally just referring to another guy at the exact same time period who this was happening to. So I've gone through most of the predictions in the Bible at one point or another, and they're nowhere near the level of specificity of a scientific prediction or even the Hindu prediction.
so even if like I can't even remember what they say it was it like maybe 83? That's a number in my brain, but that might be a low number. That 83 or maybe 100 of all these, what you would say vaguely or vague predictions, all seem to fall on one specific person. That doesn't indicate anything, because I mean, all the people with him, the apostles, they took it to mean exactly that. Um, they weren't confused about it. So,
Well, vague means it can apply to lots of different things. So if you have 1,000 vague predictions, they're going to be able to apply to a million different people because they're vague. The reason you need specificity is to make sure it doesn't apply to lots of different people. So if you have vague predictions, that by definition, that means it can apply to a lot of different people. Um, as far as I know, in the case of the apostles, I don't think they actually interpreted in the vast majority of those as prophecies. In fact, I don't know that they knew most of them. Most of them were illiterate. And the fulfillment of the prophecy seems to be something that was like added in later. It wasn't really a thing the apostles were teaching.
well, I mean, I would assume, at least came to understand it in their lifetime, because it says when Jesus came back, he explained to them um, all that was about him in the Old Testament and the prophets. So he made it clear. I mean, so they at least understood it and believed it from that point moving forward. So whatever understanding they lacked before his death and resurrection, then uh, they seem to have gotten a grasp on it going forward.
Well, sure. I think they thought he was the Messiah for sure. And the Old Testament does say a Messiah is going to come. But I don't think they were like preaching this specific passage is in fact a prophecy of the Messiah. That's the part that's really debated, because most of those things that are interpreted as prophecies weren't prophecies. There's a specific criterion for what counts as a prophecy in the Bible and for Jews, and a lot of them are just stories which are interpreted to be prophecies, but they don't mention the Messiah. It's just like something about lions and lambs, and this will happen, and it's vaguely interpreted as referring to the Messiah. And so I don't think the apostles were looking back at these specific uh, writings, or because most things back then weren't even written down, they were just passed along through voice, um, and then thinking this was a prophecy. They obviously thought he was the Messiah, but I don't think they thought of these as legitimate prophecies. Oh, that coffee is hot.
Yeah,
But
I'm a 4 ice cube kind of guy
yeah,
in my coffee.
yeah.
But
But so like going back, because my initial question, you said that you think that the reason the vast majority of scientists are atheists is because of survival bias, selection bias. They just happen to go into the field. Why do you think that? Because from my perspective, it seems like it's more, the better explanation is the fact that because the religious hypotheses don't offer predictions or any kind, that's why the vast majority of people in the sciences don't use them, because they can't. It's not really something that can be used as a scientific hypothesis, not because they're inherently biased in some way.
I mean, I think people naturally tend to, I mean, not just in the sciences, but in other, fields of work and stuff, people of certain, mentalities or biases tend to track in certain directions. I think probably, one of the big ones, right? Like media, you tend to get a lot of more like liberal minded people, I would feel like, into the media realms, um, because I just think their personality, their biases are more community. Whereas maybe if you're kind of a conservative minded person, you're more individualistic. It's, I believe what I believe. I don't really care what you believe. Whereas more liberal minded people tend, at least from my experience, to be more, I believe what I believe and we all sort of need to believe it, which I think leads them into certain fields like politics and media and stuff like that. So maybe people that tend to have that sort of mindset and bias of, you know, uh, God doesn't really satisfy my thoughts and desires about why we're here, where we're going. So I'm going to tend towards a field where I can start figuring out why we're here, where we're going, apart from that. So, um, and that may not be the perfect answer. I mean, it may not be bias. Of just in my mindset, maybe that's why they tend towards that field.
Well, did my answer before make sense about how there could be other ways other than science to know things? I remember you asked that, and I didn't give you a chance to respond.
No, no, yeah. I mean, and that's why and again, I was just trying to understand. I'm just kind of starting down my journey here, trying to make sense of it all. But um, just trying to see from someone who is more of a scientific mind, if you would lend credence to any sort of other, I guess, area of study or thought process besides just a scientific method. But yeah, I think you answered it. I mean, because I obviously would feel different about the prophecies in the Bible and Jesus, but again, that's
Oh,
my
I would count
beliefs
those
on it.
as science. Those are extremely scientific in the fact that if it makes predictions and it confirms them, that's the scientific method. That's like, so prophecy, if they were specific, would definitely be within the scientific method. Do you have any other reasons or evidence you think there are good reasons to believe in Christianity?
Well, I remember, in the email, you had mentioned, why should I believe in Christianity? And um, I think that's an interesting question, at least from what I've, kind of learned going on my journey. I don't know that that's the right idea, or at least it doesn't make sense to me. I think at least the Bible and what, Jesus taught, it's not so much should I or shouldn't I believe, but do you or don't you believe? Um, he spoke a lot in there, those who have ears to hear, let them hear. My sheep hear my voice. So, and I guess that's more of that, election versus free will argument, I guess, when you get into the religious realms, right? Of why does somebody believe when someone doesn't? Well, if they aren't intended to believe, they aren't intended for towards salvation, then I guess that would make sense as to why you wouldn't. And then in that case, if you don't believe, then you shouldn't believe, right? I mean, at least in the book of Revelation says God hates hot, or he prefers you to be hot or cold. He doesn't really care for lukewarm. So I guess just pick one and whatever your heart's being pulled towards, if it's towards belief or unbelief, I think that's probably the way it's meant to be.
Could you explain that more? Because from the way I think about it, I think that for any claim, you should try to evaluate whether or not it's true and base it on evidence, and you should proportion your belief to the evidence. And so, I don't think, I would say that the more important thing is whether or not you base your beliefs on evidence rather than specifically taking a strong stance, hot or cold, um, based on your intuition or feelings or conviction level. Uh, for me, I remember there's a quote, why would a God give us a brain and have us not use it, or something along those lines? And so if there was a God, I would expect him to want us to evaluate the evidence, to try to know it, rather than simply just believing for the sake of belief.
Yeah, I mean, I think he would, but I think, obviously the book that he gave us to evaluate the evidence on is the Bible. Um, that's what we're supposed to be studying, searching out, um, praying for, and praying for that understanding. And again, from what I would understand reading Jesus's teachings and the apostles, that again, he's going to stir up your heart to belief. And I do think that we typically can tend to believe the things that we want to believe. I do think we have that ability as humans with intellect. I mean, I want to believe that I love my wife. You could probably sit me down in a dark room and I could come up with 1,000 reasons why I shouldn't love her. But I'm not even going to ponder those, right? I don't even want to think on those really. It's not that I do love her. I mean, I do, but I want to love her as well. So it's not even so much well, it is, I believe in God, but I want to believe in God. So that's going to be what I tend towards my understanding. And I don't think, really, at least in my simpleton brain, that I have the time or the level of understanding to run down all possible roads to learn all the information that would be necessary to make, fully educated decisions on all of these areas. So you kind of have to pick the ones that you're going to go down at least far enough to understand it at a certain level before you start, diving into all the other, areas. Because then you just kind of have a mismatch of information and you're not really, I guess, fully understanding any of it, I guess, the way you probably should.
I would think of it like, if there's something you want to believe, that's the thing you should be most critical of, because we always have biases of like trying to find the information that confirms the things we want to believe or want to be true. Um, so why, in this case, why would you treat it differently? If there was something you really wanted to believe, shouldn't you doubt that the most?
I don't know why I would want to doubt it. I mean, especially if it comes to the case of, eternity, salvation, and all. I don't know why, if I'm already tending towards that belief, what would drive me to want to go looking somewhere else. I mean, again, if I love my wife now, I don't know why I need to sit down and ponder, do I really love her? Maybe I'd be happier with someone else. I think that's a fruitless endeavor. I think, and again, especially at least for me in the realm of faith and religion and eternity, I don't know if I'm already trending. Because again, if I go down the atheistic path, what does it ultimately get me? I mean, if I trend down this path and I'm wrong, what does it matter, right? I mean, that's where my belief is already leading me to. So if I fight against that every step of the way, um, to what end? I don't know. That would be worthwhile.
Well, I would see it as like, the probability you would go to heaven would be equally as the same, regardless of which belief you have. So, like, there could be a God who only lets atheists into heaven because he only likes people who go through the evidence and find out whatever is the most rational position, or something along those lines. Or maybe there's a God who only likes people who eat blueberry donuts on Tuesday. And so if you eat a blueberry donut on Tuesday, you'll get into heaven. And there could be a heaven even without a God. So, like, there are many non-God religions that have heavens, like Buddhism, where you have a field of consciousness kind of a thing that exists. And there are ways that consciousness can survive death, even in atheism, called panpsychism, where consciousness is fundamental, and there are those kinds of things. So I don't think that it's inherently more probable that one belief will get you an afterlife more than another. But my intuition is that if there's anything I feel that I really want to be true, I have this inherent bias in myself to find all of the facts that conform to that belief. And so if I want to feel justified in believing it, I would probably put it through a lot more scrutiny than I would something that I don't believe. So, like, or something I don't want to believe because I don't care about it. And so for the case of, like, in my model of morality or whatever, I put that to a much higher level of scrutiny because I care about it, because it's important to me, than I do something that, like, is the world flat? I'm just like, I just think it's kind of a joke. And so because of our inherent biases, I think the fact that we find something important gives us a reason to doubt it more. Especially even in the case of something like, does my wife love me, or something. Um, in that case, I think you could also hold that to a higher standard because of, like, if she truly loves you, will she spend time with you when you're in need or something? And you can test that. And so it's based on evidence, not based on wants. Like if you just have met a random person and you want to believe they love you, you should probably test it a little bit before you actually just believe it on no evidence, right? You should be like, okay, well, will they help me? And will they spend time with me? Will they be with me and no one else? Like you should probably test this with evidence rather than just believing on faith because you want to. Uh, so I think that in the case where we're talking about something that's really important to us, we should want a solid amount of evidence before we feel justified in our belief. In the case of your wife loving you or you loving your wife, I think you do have lots of evidence for that to be the case. So,
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that we should be seeking out the evidence to support that belief. But and maybe I'll get your take on this too. I mean, I do think because of the age in which we live in, this sort of information age, I think it leads a lot of people sort of astray that we can almost know more than we actually can really know. I mean, a lot of times, if you're reading stuff, whether it's whatever scientific, religious, I mean, most of the stuff you're reading, right? You're reading articles and stuff by people that are experts in a field. And we tend to read those and think, oh, well, this guy said it. So now I know it as well. When in fact, you don't know it, right? You just read what somebody who does know it says. That doesn't necessarily you know anything other than what they read. I mean, it takes decades to become experts in any one field. So I think we're in this age now where we think we can sort of become experts in every field. Well, I can read a little bit about every faith and come to an understanding of what they all mean. When in reality, it takes theologians, pastors, and all these people decades to become, they spend their lives learning it, right? Scientists spend their lives learning these things. And we just get little snippets and we think, okay, well, now I understand that. So I don't think that's true. And I think it leads us astray a bit. And I think that's why if you have
don't
a
think what's
belief
true.
toward, what's that?
Don't think what's true.
That just by reading, little bits of information from experts that you can somehow claim to have the same level of knowledge in an area that an expert would have, or really stake any claim to that more, than anybody else, right? If you just read something about, a star, for example, forming, and if you're not a astrophysicist or anything like that, okay, I mean, you read an article and that's great. And I'm not saying that's where you're at, but like, you're not an expert. You don't know what the expert who wrote it knows. We're just getting sort of the highlights of what he knows. And I think that can kind of lead us astray. So at least for me, and again, of someone who is of faith and is trying to learn more, I actually just recently enrolled in seminary. My goal is that's where my beliefs are tending. Again, I would say that's those who have ears to hear. I've heard, and I'm trying to go down that path and really formulate that belief and ground it. And I guess, once I get there, maybe once I would consider myself to have a full breadth of knowledge, then yeah, if you want to go and start branching out into some other things. But, I think it's, does us a little bit of a disservice to sort of just have a fire hose of information all the time. And then we just kind of have a lot of theories from a lot of really smart people that we sort of glom onto without really having a full understanding in any one of them. So again, my belief tends to lead me down that certain path. And I think that's why I don't really have a reason to shirk that belief, at least yet. I mean, at least go flush it out fully.
What was the connection between those two? So we like you said that we shouldn't simply think we know something by reading authorities, and I agree. And therefore, you have a belief, and you shouldn't shirk that belief.
Well, I was just making, the point that, if you were saying earlier that if you believe something, you put it under more scrutiny, which would tend to lead you to maybe try to seek out other answers or see if that holds up to intense scrutiny. But I think the important part of that is to actually learn it before you start scrutinizing it. So if I say I want to become an expert in Christianity, and then I read through the Bible once and I go, now let's go and disprove it all. Well, I don't really know Christianity, right? It takes years and years to understand everything about it. And it would be the same way as if I said, I want to become a chemist. And then I, buy a chemistry set on Amazon and I do a test and I'm like, let me go and disprove chemistry. Well, you don't understand chemistry, right? You need to actually walk that path, like the expert did for years and years and years until you actually have an understanding of what you're working with so you can legitimately try to prove or disprove it. That would be my case for following the path that you're naturally trending towards, rather than just dismissing it outright and trying to disprove it before you actually understand it.
What would that mean to like understand something in that context? Because from my perspective, like how much do you need to understand something before you start to criticize it? I think that's an epistemology question. Like you need some way to have a ground of knowledge. And then once you have a way to have a ground of knowledge, you can question other things using that method. And for me, that method is going to be novel testable predictions, the way to differentiate imagination from reality. Um, but do you need like a way? Do you really need to have like a mastery of a topic before you can understand something? Because I would think that as long as you have that minimum criterion of a method that you can use to distinguish imagination from reality, that'll give you an inclination, even if you're not an expert. So, like, if an expert said, if you add this chemical to this chemical, it'll turn purple, and I do it and it turns purple. Like he made a prediction about the future. He was right, even though I understand nothing about what just happened chemically. He was right, so I have a really good reason to trust that, even though I'm not an expert. Wouldn't you agree in that case?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you're walking along that path of knowledge, I mean, you should be looking at what your assumptions are and, formulating them better. But I don't think that necessarily means that you stop your learning on that path to go and start learning something that's the complete opposite. Because then you haven't really fully fleshed out those. I just, for my case, I was raised very charismatic in my childhood. But as I've gotten older, and again, we were talking about, free will and election a little earlier, that's something where just in my own life, my own prayer life, studying the Bible, I've kind of dismissed a lot of that charismatic flavor because I don't think it held up to scripture. When I read scripture, that's not what I see in my normal day to day life. That's not what I see. So you make those small corrections as you go, but I wouldn't, because I come to something I disagree with, like, speaking in tongues or something, then I go, well, not learning that anymore. Let me go and focus on something completely different. You're making those small corrections on your path towards continuing your learning. And I think just generally as a person, you kind of have to be interested in stuff before you actually care enough to learn about it. Um, you know, you're not going to devote the time and the energy mentally to learn something that you just don't have any sort of passion or will to learn at all. So I do think there's some human nature in there.
Well, you said you should learn all about one field before trying to learn something that's like the complete opposite or contradictory. That part I don't think I would agree with, because I think you can test differing contradictory hypotheses at the same time. So like if there's a scientist and a witch doctor, for example, and they say, here's a novel testable prediction about chemistry, here's a novel testable prediction about voodoo, and I can test them both and see which ones work and which ones don't, even if they're contradictory. And even if I don't understand, I have a mastery of zero voodoo or chemistry, I can still say chemistry is correct because I have this method of it makes testable predictions, which are confirmed in the future. And so even without a mastery, I think I can still evaluate contradictory hypotheses, to figure out which one's more rational in like by the testing it with some kind of method.
Yeah, I mean, if I said that earlier, I must have mistakenly said. I don't think you should just shun learning anything else besides your one specific area. And I think in natural course of life, you're going to learn and pick up things, especially in the realm of faith. You're going to get a lot of contradictory information that you have to wrestle with a little bit. But again, and maybe witch doctory and you know, chemistry, is a better
Yeah.
one, I guess. I would say maybe in the realm of Christianity, if you want to talk about, the signs and wonders, and the laying out of hands for healing. And you're like, well, I have a healing gift. And they're like, well, that's a doctor. Well, you can test that. And yeah, he prayed on him and he probably doesn't have a gift of healing because the guy wasn't healed and the doctor gave him some pain medication. He feels better. But again, I don't think that would be reason to just throw out your faith or throw out learning down that path. You would correct maybe what you understand. And again, at least for me, that's where I've progressed, at least to this simple point in my faith. And I'm hoping to learn more as I continue to walk down this road. But I do think obviously you're going to pick up other information that you're going to have to wrestle with and try to understand. along the way. So I don't think learning ever really stops from from a multitude of areas. But I don't think it's right either just to be like, oh, well, I heard something from this guy, so I'm just going to accept that as true without really, flushing it out. But then again, that takes time, right, to fully understand to a level that I think you would need to, or at least you should, before you just abandon prior beliefs. You should give it time to flush it out.
Yeah, for sure. That would be like the method I mentioned. For me, it's novel testable prediction. So if I read something new, make a prediction about some experiment we could do and test it before I find it more reasonable. Even if I'm not an expert, I can still say, chemistry said add this chemical to this chemical, it'll produce this color. Test it, like, yep, produce that color. That's good. Even though I have no idea what happened, but it worked. That's all that matters. And so I think you should definitely test your ideas. And then if, for example, one person comes up with a bunch of ideas that are very successful, and his fundamental model for making predictions is contradictory to your model, I think that it's better to say his model is more likely to be true than yours, even if you can try to make that data fit your model.
So, I mean, like, what examples are you thinking of? Like,
Well,
is
like
this
the
back to your
brain.
whole the brain and
Well, anything. So the brain or naturalism, physicalism versus spiritualism. Like if a physicist is able to make predictions, or a neurologist may make predictions about the brain, and they think it's physical, and think because it's physical, we can do stuff to it and change your consciousness. It seems like, I mean, you can always fit data into any hypothesis. It's just called the problem of underdetermination. You can always do that with any hypothesis. Like you could say, we're a brain in a vat, and all information was produced by the electrodes. Therefore, the world's actually flat. So the world's really, really flat, but it's all of our visualization. It's all just electrodes. And so, even a flat earther can make all the evidence fit. But it seems like the more rational thing to do is to say, no, the globe guys are probably right. They made all these predictions. They can do all this calculation data about like how we can travel through the planet by calculating the rotation of the planet with little gyroscope thingies, with laser gyroscopes. And so they're probably right. The world is probably round. Now I can't go to space and see it, and I'm asked to evaluate data based off what I can see. And I can see that the flat earthers don't make predictions. The round earthers do make predictions. And so even if I started as a flat earther, I think the more rational thing to do is to get rid of that belief and say, well, since we can't really make a successful model compared to them, they're probably right. Now we can make all the data fit. We can take all of the globe earth data and make it fit our model, but I don't think that's the rational thing to do at that point. I think it's more rational to say, nope, you guys have a better basis of evidence. Even if you want to still reject it, it's like, nah, you guys have the better evidence, but I still think I'm going to reject it for personal reasons. That's fine. But I think it's still rational to say that they have a better evidence or something along those lines.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. Is again, going back to the whole idea of neurologists predicting, intelligence and conscious, and trying to claim that uh, you know fits without a god and stuff. Again, without me really understanding it, I don't really have a strong grasp on that one way or the other. Again, it doesn't make sense to me as I sit here today. Um, so that's really all I can, I guess, answer about that. So,
Gotcha. We do have some questions from the audience.
okay.
Vlad the Stoner asks, why doesn't God answer prayers from people in serious need and help who are good Christians? Is there a checklist to pass?
Uh, I mean, I would say God does answer prayers to people in serious need. I guess you just have to maybe hang it on to he didn't answer the prayer to that person that I knew who was in serious need. Um, but I mean, there's testimonies all around the world, all throughout history, that God answers prayers of people that are in serious need. Um, and then, help who are good Christians. Again, I would say there are testimonies all around the world of people who God helped. The Bible's full of them who, but then again, we're all, as the Bible said, our righteousness is filthy rags. So there's none righteous except Christ. So we're just clinging on to him and, hoping, uh, again, that his righteousness can be accounted to us, that imputed righteousness. But again, I would say that there's testimonies all around the world. There's books written every year about testimonies of God moving in people's lives in serious situations. So I I would say it does exist. I can't hear you.
I muted myself.
Oh, oh, sorry.
So, um, do you think those are better explained by God actually interacting in the world rather than just an unknown natural cause?
uh, no, I mean, I would say you have to take the person's testimony first and foremost as the major point of evidence. I mean, if someone's telling you, I was whatever, sick and dying and stage 4 cancer, whatever, and I showed up the next day and it was gone. Uh, I would take their testimony at least up front, right, before you start doing any digging. Um, but don't discredit them right out the gate. If that's their testimony, um, then I would take that as my first point of evidence, I suppose.
Even given the fact that we know there's lots of spontaneous remissions that happen in all diseases, I obviously, like if we have no other data other than the testimony or something, but since we already have lots of data in science about spontaneous remission happening in lots of diseases, don't you think it's more reasonable to say it was probably one of those rather than their testimony being correct, whether it was Christianity or Hinduism or whatever they think healed
I mean,
them?
sure, it's worth looking into and not discrediting. But again, I mean, a person has their testimony, and um, again, you don't have to believe every testimony because some of them get pretty outlandish. But um, I think a person's experience, at least worth listening to and validating at some level before you just discredit it outright. At least pay them, I guess, enough credit to look into it, I suppose.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm always for looking into anything. I think that's always a good approach to things. Um, a question for me: how specific do you think predictions need to be? I don't know how best to answer that, but it needs to be specific enough that it's unambiguously understandable from a genuine person or from an average person what it's intended to say, rather than being able to be interpreted from multiple perspectives to mean different things. Question from Hillary's emails. I get it. If you never spoke with nor met your wife and only had other people's comments about her to go on, would you love her just the same as now?
I mean, I guess maybe if I had a 1,000-page book of love letters written to me from her, that might be a good indication. But then again, that would be basically saying that people's prayer life has no effect on them, and that what they feel in their spirit, here in their mind, and in their prayer life, again, you're just discrediting that up front, I suppose. So I would say um, reading the Word of God is hearing from God. That's the way we hear from God, um, by and large. And so I guess if I'd never met my wife and never heard anything from her, and it was just a name off in the distance, yeah, I probably wouldn't love her. Um, but again, if I had a, a book like the Bible written about my wife, and that it was all done for me, I suppose, then that might change my tune a little bit.
Gotcha. Tim asks, what is your best reason to follow religion?
What is my best reason to follow religion? Uh, I mean, I guess my best reason is if you believe in that religion, that's your best reason to follow it. Um, if you don't believe, then you have no reason to follow it. Um, I'm sure lots of uh, people that would tell you in different studies. I mean, our entire country, the founders would tell you that living this more moral and virtuous lifestyle, based off of a lot of the teachings in the Bible, would produce the best life for us as a country and as citizens in this country. But again, if you don't believe that the Bible is true and that it's the word of God, then why would you? I guess, other than if you want to, I guess, live a life that isn't, I don't know, void of common morals and values, I suppose, that's found in a holy book.
All right. Brian Stevens asks, question for guest, if he really wants to learn, why doesn't he take a free course on logic? Oh, so that's more mean. You ignore that one.
Uh,
Take logic courses are boring anyway. A waste of time.
oh, that's all right.
Question for Lovely Spence. You have a fan in the audience. What is your biggest fear about not being a Christian?
Uh, I mean, I guess eternal separation from God, right? Not making it into heaven would be your ultimate fear of not being a Christian. Paul tells us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. King Solomon tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So, uh, our fear of being separated from Him is, I guess, my biggest fear of not being a Christian.
Gotcha. Sheen asks, can you tell when God doesn't answer prayers, I imagine?
Uh, yeah. If I ask for $1 million and it doesn't show up, that's a pretty easy way to understand that He didn't answer that prayer, right? But then again, that's why it's important to make sure that your prayers are in line with what Scripture teaches your prayers to be about, and not just worldly, self-fulfilling prayers that God is unlikely to answer. If I prayed to God for $1 million, that would be foolish on my part.
Gotcha. I think that's it for the questions. Uh, Travis asks, how do you define faith and whether it's consistent with having true beliefs?
How do I define faith? Um, I mean, faith is, I guess, just your belief in, I guess, things yet to happen or things unseen, right? I guess. I'm sure there's better definitions of what faith is, but placing your faith, I think Jesus tells Thomas, right, that he saw him and believed, but blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believe, right? So that's that faith in things that you haven't seen yet. Um, and I guess, yeah, you have to have some level of faith to have true belief, I suppose. It's hard to believe in something that you don't actually ever think is going to come about or have any real chance of. I'm a Lions fan, a Detroit Lions fan. It's hard to have faith that they're going to make it to the Super Bowl because I just don't believe it, even though I try to trick myself into it every year. So.
All right. Question from Facts and Conspiracy. What's the best explanation or the next best explanation for everything we see written in the Bible?
What's the next best explanation?
Yeah. So like of any given piece of evidence, there's like if a cup fell over, a squirrel did it, the winds did it, somebody bumped the table. There's a bunch of different explanations that could explain the data. So if we assume, or if we have all of the evidence of everything written in the Bible, explanation 1 is it's all true, written by God. Explanation 2 is what?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I guess that it was written by man. I would say, like the Quran and stuff, right? I mean, not written by God, written by man. So that would probably be the best explanation for the next plausible reason, I suppose.
That makes sense. There's a few people who've said it's completely impossible to explain other than by God did it. And that's, I think, what he was seeing if you're one of
Yeah, I
those or
mean,
one of the other ones.
I do think the Bible is, John MacArthur would call the Bible the only miracle you'll ever hold in your hands. And I would tend to agree with that. How the Bible was formed and how it came together is pretty incredible. But I mean, obviously, there always has to be another option, I suppose, out there somewhere. So,
Yeah, absolutely. That's in science, problem of underdetermination. There's always infinitely many ways to explain all the data. And so it's a very rational position to take. And it's some people who just say it's impossible unless God or whatever. It's a really strange position that I don't really understand. Question from Cameron Hill. Why do you trust the Bible when it gets nothing scientifically accurate?
again, I'm not smart enough scientifically to understand what it gets right or wrong. But I mean, again, there are smarter people than me in the realm of science that are wrestling with those very questions, and those people don't seem to have any issues with believing the Bible. So, again, I'm hoping to learn, increase in knowledge there as much as I can. But yeah, I don't know exactly because again, the Bible isn't necessarily a science book, right? It's a spiritual guide in a sense. But again, the creation of the world makes sense to me uh, from the Genesis account. And again, without any sort of deeper understanding, I'm just gonna, I guess, hold on to that. I mean, again, I haven't flushed out that stuff in the way that is probably necessary. But again, that's why I'm walking the road I'm walking, I suppose.
Gotcha. And I think that's referring to like biblical literalism, 7-day creation, world flood, those kinds of things, where there's a lot of disagreement in like archaeology.
Right. And I mean, there's, been a lot of, I guess, differences and changes throughout. I remember reading a book, oh man, probably a decade ago now. It was called Measuring Eternity. I don't know if you've ever read that book. I don't know how well known it was. I found it on a deployment in the library. Um, but I read it and it was all about, it wasn't atheistic or religious. It was just sort of looking at all understandings from the religious world and the scientific world of trying to measure the age of the universe. And it was just an interesting book to see, from the time of, ancient days when the earth was thought to be a certain age, then it continued to increase in age and it continued to get older and older and older and older and older. And it, every however many years it was in that book, it's probably a 20-year-old book by now, but you could see that it would continually get older and older and older. So the age of the earth, I would assume, if it hasn't changed recently, I would bet that it probably will at some point, because that was the track record that at least he was panning out there. So I would say that even science hasn't gotten it right. They've gotten it right as best they can, but they're still working. It's still changing, even if it hasn't for a little while. Measuring Eternity says it will, I guess, supposedly, because it has, I guess.
Gotcha. All right. We've been going for about an hour. I really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work, your podcasts?
Yeah, I mean, Religionless Christianity podcast on really wherever you listen to podcasts. We're on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and stuff like that. So you can come find us there. But I do appreciate you taking the time and letting me jump on here with you. That was
Absolutely.
not meant
Also,
to be said
random
that way.
question. Do
Yeah.
you have like how do you upload the podcast? Do you have a thing that uploads it to like all of them automatically for you? Or do you have to do it manually one by one?
No, I do. So we use Red Circle. Just record the podcast, upload it to Red Circle, and it distributes everywhere. There's a handful you may have to go in there and specifically upload. But what's great about podcasts is a lot of the big ones, Apple, Spotify, and Google, a lot of the smaller podcast platforms just pull all their episodes from the big ones. So if you get it on sort of the big three, it tends to get out to everybody pretty easily. So yeah, there's a lot of good podcast hosting platforms that can kind of get your message out there pretty easily.
Awesome. Thanks. I'll definitely check out Red Circle. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest